Let's rock and rumble.
Yep. Now it just seems so funny because there's no chatter as we're waiting for participants to join.
No. I thought I lost everybody. I started to panic.
You cut us all off.
Right?
Got to start all over again.
Oh, no.
So, Noah, what state are you in?
I am in Florida.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
And
you're
then
in our
Molly, where?
region.
Molly, yeah, he's our region. Molly, where are you?
I am in the great state of Idaho.
Oh, okay.
Oh, way over there.
Yeah.
Although I really miss in-person conferences, these sort of Zoom conferences and things that have happened just because of COVID has really probably allowed more people to attend, people who couldn't travel, you know, either because of disability or finances or something like that. But it throws another big clinker in there when you have to think about the different time zones. And
Yeah.
you can't start a 9 a.m. Eastern time session when there's people in the state of Washington where it's like 5 in the morning or whatever.
Or Cheryl out there in Hawaii with a 6-hour time difference. I'm thinking that
Yeah.
when we've even started at noon, that was 6 o'clock out there. So yeah,
Renee,
that's the part that's rugged.
when I was still working at Disability Rights and Resources in Charlotte, and I was in Hawaii, there were a couple folks that, you know, I used to call and email me, you know, ask me for information and stuff. And I was out there sometimes at 6 o'clock in the morning calling people in Kannapolis or Monroe or something because, you know, it was like noon for them and I needed to answer them. And it was just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of issues when you do in-person conferences that have to be transportation issues and accessibility issues and things that have to be thought about. But when you're doing these internet conferences, there's other issues that have to be considered and taken into effect.
Right. There's definitely a trade-off there.
Yep.
And just so we can keep in mind, because we do have a cart person, and I know we're kind of under a 1-hour time constraint, but if we can talk slow, a little bit slower, that would help the cart person.
Definitely. I'm used to doing that with working with a lot of sign language interpreters, so slowing myself down is no problem.
Well, thanks for the reminder, though, because I tend to talk fast, so I have to. That's a good reminder. Thank you.
Are we ready to begin? Because it is 2 past.
Yes.
All righty, welcome everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Noah Russell, and I am your Youth Steering Committee Vice Chair, and I will be your moderator for today's session. I just like to lay down a couple of housekeeping items before we start this amazing workshop today. First off, when you scroll down to the screen, a menu bar will pop up. Depending on what device you're on, you can find the menu bar at the top or at the bottom of your screen. This is where you will find the closed captioning for today's session. You can view the captioning by selecting the CC tab on the menu bar. For sign language interpreting, you can find the interpreter on the screen. If you are only able to see the speaker, make sure you're in gallery view so you can see the interpreter and the presentation at the same time. If you would like to see the interpreter larger, you can choose to pin them. You can go to the top right-hand corner of the interpreter screens and select the triple dot button. This will give you the option to pin. You make them larger by pinning and then selecting the speaker view. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat feature. You can find the word bubble in that same menu bar. Once that's selected, that will allow you to follow along with the chat or add in your comments. If you feel like to turn the chat feature off, if you're using a screen reader, you can do that by pressing the Alt H button. To ask a question, make a comment. You can also select the hand option on the menu bar, and that allows us to know you have a question. For those on the phone today or using keystrokes, we ask you to use *9 or Alt-Y on your keyboard to raise your hand. We will then let you know when you can unmute. You can select the unmute button or press Alt-A if using keystrokes. Remember, if you are joining in on the conversation, to keep all background noise down as much as possible to allow us to hear you clearly. And I am going to pass you to our hosts, Rebecca Williams and Renee.
Hi, I'm Renee Cummins. I am a mixed white and Cherokee woman with long, dark hair, very dark eyes, high cheekbones, and I'm wearing my favorite color, red, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'll pass it over to Becky.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Williams. I'm a white woman. I have a little bit below my shoulder, kind of dark blonde, light brown hair. I wear glasses, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. So I guess we're ready for the next slide, please. Oh, that's me. So, oh, too far. I'm back. Okay. So I work for the Southeast ADA Center. I need to say that we are funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. Syracuse University, the Burton Blatt Institute actually holds our grant. That was slide 2, so next slide 3 will be in slide 3.
Okay, this is Renee. This is the standard disclaimer from the Southeast ADA Center. A lot of text, looks really imposing, but basically what you need to understand from this slide is that our presentation today is intended for informal guidance only. And this is not intended to be a presentation or a determination of your rights and responsibilities under the law. So let's go to slide 4 and I'll hand it back to Becky.
Yep, so this is Rebecca. So I will describe the pictures on the slides for anyone who may have some vision loss. So the slide is we're going to talk about who is protected under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, but there's 2 pictures on the slide. The one on the left is a very blonde-headed girl holding a surfboard with a big cutout of it, and her left arm is been amputated right at the shoulder. The picture on the right is a young boy who's sitting cross-legged on the floor. His hands are parallel in front of him, and it looks like he's looking at a laptop or something. And so, who is protected under the ADA and Fair Housing? It's individuals with disabilities, who the definition is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And we'll go to slide number 5, please. Okay, so we're just going to first real briefly just talk about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing. And on the slide, on the left is a picture of an apartment complex with in the foreground is a swimming pool. In the middle of the slide is a for rent sign, and then below that is a Section 8 housing sign, and the right side shows a clubhouse area with a pool table and some chairs and stuff. So generally, the ADA does not apply to privately owned housing. So when you're looking at apartment complexes that are privately owned or condos, or you're renting a house, the ADA will not apply. However, rental offices at apartment complex or condo complexes would apply, because that is a place of commerce. People can come in there to make an application and apply for housing. So that would fall under the ADA. If the swimming pool or the clubhouse at your apartment complex is available for rent to people who don't live there, I can go rent this clubhouse to have my Christmas office party, and that is going to trigger the ADA. And I think that's probably all I wanted to say about that. So we'll go to the next slide, number 6.
Okay, this is Renee again. Slide number 6 is about the Fair Housing Act and housing. So where Becky was saying that the ADA is outside of the residence, fair housing is applying within the residence, as well as those common areas, common use areas that are within the residence and part of what you get as a benefit of residing there. But on this slide, the main point I want to stress here is that because you're all at an independent living conference, I'm sure that you understand about choice and that people with disabilities have a right to make their own choices. Under the Fair Housing Act, people with disabilities should have the same right to choose housing that is available to people without disabilities. So on this slide, we have 5 photos, and you're going to have a person with significant low vision telling you what's on these photos. So it's not going to be as in-depth as an actual audio describer, because I use audio describers. But these 5 photos are examples of housing that I found in my neighborhood. So there are 2 on the top row, and the one on the left is an example of a duplex. The one on the right is a row of townhouses. And then there are 3 photos on the bottom row. The one on the far left is a freestanding house, just a private residence house in the neighborhood. The one in the middle on the bottom is a large apartment complex. And the one on the right on the bottom is a very large complex of condominiums. So these are all choices that people with disabilities and people without disabilities should have available and should have the option to choose as housing under the Fair Housing Act. So let's move to the next slide, slide 7. And on slide 7, this slide addresses where does the Fair Housing Act apply? The Fair Housing Act applies both in rental situations as well as in home ownership. So whether you want to be a renter or you want to try to own your own home, both of these options are covered under the Fair Housing Act. On this slide, we have a row of 3 pictures, and they illustrate part of the process of both the rental option as well as home ownership. On the far left, there are some Scrabble tiles, and the ones that are set up on the little tray spell out landlord. So that refers to Fair Housing Act, covers all of the process of renting housing. In the middle photo, there are 2 people conducting some kind of a transaction. So this could be 2 people negotiating a rental lease. It could be a rental situation. It also could be a loan officer at a bank negotiating a mortgage loan with a prospective homeowner. So that could be a step in the process of either renting or home ownership. And then on the far right is a sign outside of a residence, a dwelling, and the sign says open house. And there are people standing in the doorway. So quite likely those are possibly a realtor and some prospective home buyers, and that would be a home ownership situation. Under the Fair Housing Act, the important thing to remember is that every step in the process of either renting or buying a house, all of that process is covered under the Fair Housing Act, and any decisions made by a landlord, a mortgage loan officer, anyone that is in the position of making those decisions have to be based on objective facts, and they cannot be decisions made based on assumptions or stereotypes about all of us as people with disabilities. That's the discrimination that is outlawed under the Fair Housing Act. So it's important to keep in mind every step of that process of obtaining housing through renting or housing through home ownership, that all is covered and should be based on those objective facts that would apply to people with and without disabilities. So let's move on to slide 8, and I'll throw it back over to Becky.
Okay, yeah, this is Rebecca again. So the slide talks about types of things that are discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act. So housing providers, and again, as Renee said, it applies in the entire process of applying for housing or trying to find housing. So Fair Housing Act requires that people can ask for an accommodation that's reasonable, which an accommodation under the Fair Housing Act is a change in a policy, practice, or procedure. So it could be we're a no pets community, but the accommodation is a change in that policy so that somebody could have a service animal. So that's a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. Fair Housing Act also says it's discriminatory to not provide a reasonable modification. Reasonable modifications are changes to property that might be needed so a person with a disability can use and enjoy the premise. So it might be somebody needs to put a ramp up at the entrance to their duplex because there's steps and they're a wheelchair user. Under fair housing, with the design and construction requirements, when there are 4 more units, so when it's multifamily housing, 4 more units, there are some basic design and construction requirements for accessibility. So any new unit, and this is from March 13th, 1991, any multifamily housing unit built from then forward should meet those basic 7 design and construction requirements. Intentional discrimination, as Renee kind of alluded to when she just spoke. So you can't intentionally discriminate against a person with a disability in housing based on their disability. And disparate impact is if having a policy that, although you're not trying to discriminate against a person with a disability, ends up having that effect. And some of the other things, though, that aren't listed on this slide, but refusal to rent to somebody, not just based on disability, but under the ADA, but under the Fair Housing Act, refusal to rent to somebody based on their being in a specific group, such as race or age or disability, is discriminatory. If a housing provider denies that apartment is now available, somebody might read that this duplex or this apartment's available, and then you go to apply for it, and now all of a sudden they say, oh, no, it's not available, because they see you have an obvious disability. That type of behavior is discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act. Advertising only to a specific group of people and not making it known that housing is available is also discriminatory. Retaliation. So if somebody asks to have a ramp built, and then the housing provider gets upset about that and wants to raise the rent in retaliation for that person exercising their rights under the Fair Housing Act, that is discriminatory. So when people exercise their rights under the Fair Housing Act, any sort of retaliatory action is also prohibited and considered discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act. And then we will go to the next slide, number 9, and Renee.
Okay, so this is Renee. Slide 9 is what are reasonable accommodations. And this is what Becky was touching on before. A reasonable accommodation is a change in a rule or policy or procedure. And this change is requested by a person with a disability because it is needed for that person to have an equal opportunity to fully use or fully enjoy their dwelling or the public or common areas, like I mentioned before. And those public or common areas are what Becky was talking about before with apartment complex, for example, that has a clubhouse or a swimming pool or a fitness center, all those kind of things that come with being a resident at that particular apartment complex. Those have to be available for the person with a disability to be able to get the full use and enjoyment out of them as well. So the reasonable accommodation is a change in some policy or rule or procedure that will permit that to happen for the person with a disability. The person with a disability is responsible for asking for what it is that they need that will allow them to be able to fully use and enjoy the dwelling and the common areas. And they have to make that known to the landlord or management. And it's best to do that in writing so that there is a record of it. And in that request, it needs to be stated what that person needs and how that accommodation will benefit them or will meet that need. And then it is up to the landlord or the management or whoever is receiving that request to decide if that is a reasonable request. In other words, if that can be accommodated because it is reasonable for the landlord or the management to do that. And by reasonable, we mean that it would not be an undue burden. So it is not extremely difficult. It wouldn't be that difficult to do it, or it would not be excessively costly. It wouldn't be that costly to be able to make that accommodation request. So I'm going to use my own example from my experience back when I was a renter. And I would go into a management office, a rental office, and my request was that I needed someone to sit down and go over the lease agreement with me so that if I had questions, I could ask those questions at the time that we're reviewing the lease. And the reason why I needed that is because I am a person with a disability and I cannot read standard print. Now, I didn't specifically say what my disability is. It could be a reading disability. It could be a learning disability. It could be a visual processing disability. And maybe I do much better with auditory processing, or it could be due to my significant low vision. Now, the management, the landlord can request documentation, is not required under the Fair Housing Act to request documentation, but they can ask for documentation from a professional to verify that you are a person with a disability and that what you are asking for is related to your disability. So at that point, it would probably be very obvious to the landlord, and was in the past, that my documentation comes from someone who is saying that I have significant low vision or, something to that effect, then I cannot read standard print. At any rate, I have disclosed that I'm a person with a disability. I have stated what I need, and I need it because it's related to my disability. I cannot read standard print. And that would allow me to be able to very carefully go over this rental lease before I sign it, because I want to thoroughly understand it. I want to have an opportunity to ask questions before I sign it. Now it is up to the landlord, and the landlord can and did come back and say to me, I only have one staff person in the rental office at one time, and I need that person to be available to answer the phone and to talk to people who walk in and drop into the rental office. So it's a negotiated process, and the landlord might say to me, as has happened to me before, why don't we set up an appointment, an agreed upon time when you could come in, and meaning me, and the landlord would provide a second staff person so that that person would be able to simply meet with me, sit down, go over the rental agreement very carefully, and also be able to answer any questions that I had. And that was how the interactive process worked for me in the past, and how I was able to get a reasonable accommodation in order to get the rental dwelling that I wanted that would meet my needs. So that's the explanation of what are reasonable accommodations. And now we'll move to slide 10, and I'll give it back to Becky.
Yep, thanks, Renee. So this is Rebecca again, and I just want to stress a point that Renee made, and I'm glad she brought that up. Under the Fair Housing Act, if the need for either a reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification is not apparent, in other words, if you can't really see the disability, the housing provider can request limited medical documentation. Doesn't have to include your diagnosis, but that, yes, this so-and-so is under my care. I treat them for a condition that's a disability, and then how that disability may limit the individual, and then relates the need for the requested accommodation or modification to the disability. That's very different than the ADA. And people are used to the ADA saying you can't ask me about my disability, but the Fair Housing Act is very different. And the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the enforcing agency for the Fair Housing Act, has said documentation can be obtained. So just to use another example real quick here, though, of reasonable accommodations, I think I mentioned earlier, let's say it's a no pet community and somebody has a service animal, but they don't look like they have a disability. Let's say it's a medical alert service animal. The landlord or the property owner can request medical documentation that this person has a disability and the need for the animal. And it could just be something simply as this is a medical alert animal. So again, Renee was talking about accommodations, which are changes in policies. Modifications are structural changes to the property that are needed. A big difference between accommodations and modifications. Modifications are at the expense of the tenant. So if I'm a person with, I had a stroke and I have hemiplegia or paralyzed on one side of my body, but I know swimming is good for me. And when I can get in the pool, I can move, I can exercise in the pool. As a reasonable modification, I could ask my landlord or the management of my apartment complex if I could put a lift in the pool because I can't walk down the steps. That is at my expense. Modifications is the same as accommodations when Renee was talking about, is it reasonable? It's not going to cost the management anything, so that undue difficulty or expense doesn't come into play. So that's a big difference. Modifications, structural changes, whether it's to the unit, inside the unit. Maybe I need to have take my bathtub out and have a walk-in shower, a roll-in shower put in, or it could be something as simple as grab bars put up in the bathroom, or a ramp entrance, or a lift at a pool. That is going to be at my expense. Now, if I ever move out of that condo or apartment complex or duplex or wherever I leave, my landlord can require that any interior changes that I've made be restored. So they could say, you've got to take your grab bars down when you leave. Or they could say, you've got to take that ramp down when you leave. Changes, however, structural changes made to common areas. So if I do install a pool lift, I don't have to take that pool lift out. So structural changes to common areas can remain, but the landlord can say anything you've done inside your unit, you restore when it's possible. If I widen doorways because I had a bigger wheelchair, I might not be able to put it back down to a 32-inch doorway, but that's all part of that reasonable modifications. The individual who needs the structural change, the change to the property, also is responsible for obtaining any building permits, and the owner of the property can say it has to be done in a workmanship-like manner, meaning licensed contractors, that Uncle George just can't come put up my ramp because maybe Uncle George doesn't really know how to put up ramps, but he said he'd help me. So the property manager can say this structural change that you're doing has to be done by a professional. And I think that about covers it for the reasonable modification. So I'll turn it back to Renee for slide 11.
Okay, thank you, Becky.
Just as the host, there is a question pertaining to what you were just speaking about in the Q&A.
Okay, so the question is, I was looking at chat, I didn't see that. Thank you for pulling that up. So the question is, does the documentation for non-apparent disabilities have to be from a physician or other providers who are familiar with the prospective tenant's disability and need for accommodation modifications, also acceptable under the Fair Housing Act? And yes, it doesn't have to be, maybe the person has a psychological disability, a mental health disability. It can be from a therapist, it can be from a psychologist, psychiatrist. It doesn't have to always be a physician. And if that answers the question for the person, I hope that answers the question, but it doesn't, it's just somebody who is familiar, who has treated the individual. Sometimes it could be a social worker. There's a couple of really good documents that we have listed in the resources that talk about the type of documentation that can be accepted. And even social workers are listed on there. So I hope that answers it.
Okay, let's go to slide 11. Slide 11 asks the question, where can you look for housing? So this is a list on these bullet points, and I'm just going to read through our list. These are some ideas of different resources and places that you could look for housing. First, Centers for Independent Living. They often have connections with a lot of housing resources and know about the housing in your community. Second bullet is state and local housing coalitions. Here in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I am, we have a North Carolina Housing Coalition. And so it has various information about different state and local housing coalitions across North Carolina, public housing programs, Section 811 supportive housing for persons with disabilities, the Section 8 voucher program. Next one is Housing Choice Voucher Program. After that is the HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development, Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing vouchers. And these are vouchers made available through the VA system to veterans. Next one is Homeownership Vouchers. And then the last one on our list is word of mouth, asking around to family, friends, people you know, other people that have successfully obtained housing, and just different people that might, by word of mouth, be able to give you good leads and good information. So that's our partial list. And now, if we could hear from all of you, if you could put some of your ideas in the chat box of what are your ideas of where you might look for housing in your community. So feel free to put an idea in the chat box of something that you know of because it's available in your community, or something that we did not think of and is not on our list, or an idea that you have that you would like to share. And I'm going to let Becky read some ideas that are coming in the chat box, and we'll take a pause here and just share some of those before we go on to slide 12.
Yeah, this is Rebecca. At this point, Renee, I don't see anything in the chat room. We can just wait maybe another couple seconds to see if folks might have an idea of where they could look for housing.
Especially if you have actually successfully obtained housing, if you look for housing, and even if it's something on our list, what worked for you? What did you use in terms of a resource that led to being able to find and obtain housing, if you have done that? We just wanted to pause for a bit and see if you have some other ideas that you would like to share. And if not, we'll move on to slide 12 in a little bit. Go ahead.
Yep, I think we should just probably go ahead and move on. I don't see anything in the chat, Renee.
Okay, let's move to slide 12.
Real quick, sorry, Renee.
Go ahead.
Andy said my YSA Young Single Adults Warrior Club. So that's a good idea. If you belong to any support groups, or even, like I belong to a knitters guild, so I could always ask at my knitters guild and stuff. So there was one response there. So great. Craigslist. Somebody said Craigslist. If you're desperate. I found a disabled senior complex through my friend who lives there. There's another. This is Rebecca again. There is a website, and I'll put it in the chat. It's socialserve.com, and people can look there. Let me maybe put it in before I forget. Okay, you can go on that website and you can put in the state you live, and then that'll pull up the cities where folks have advertised on socialserve.com. But it's really pretty good, because if you need to be close to a bus line, if you need to be close to a hospital, if you need to have housing that accepts pets, if you need 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, fully accessible, you can really narrow down on socialserve.com what you need in housing, and then and price range. What is my price range? And then it will pull up for your city, and then in your state, housing that's been advertised through socialserve.com that's going to meet all your parameters and all your needs for housing. So that's another one. But I actually did hear about Craigslist before, so it's a good one. Thanks. Okay, Renee.
So for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to slide 12. And on slide 12, we want you to think about, what do you need in housing? And I'll use my own experience as an example. I now own a house, but before I bought this house, I had 2 absolute needs that I could not buy a house unless it met these 2 requirements. One was I had to be near or on a public transit line. And the second one was that I had to have audible signals to be able to cross the street where the public transit is, because those of you who also use public transit know that you get picked up on one side of the street, but then for your return trip on the bus or whatever your public transit happens to be, you're going to be let out on the other side of the street. So I absolutely had to have those audible signals so that I knew that I could safely get back and forth across that street in order to use the public transit. So those were my two absolute needs when I was looking for housing to buy when I became a homeowner. So we have a partial list here of some things that you might be looking for in terms of housing. And I'm just going to read through our list quickly, and then we're going to give you a chance to share your ideas on this question as well. So some ideas are accessible features that are already in place, adequate parking, public transportation, like that was one of my needs, one of my absolute needs, close to shopping, sidewalks, and sidewalks with curb cuts, sidewalks in good shape. That's something that I absolutely needed. Grassy areas, if you have a service animal and you're going to have to take your service animal out to a relief area, so you would absolutely be looking for those grassy areas that are nearby. Or it might be a feature such as a clubhouse, a swimming pool, or a fitness center. Now that's some suggestions that we had and a couple of ideas from my own personal experience. So now we'd like to, again, have you share in the chat box, what are your ideas for what would you be looking for that you absolutely need in housing when you're looking for housing, that this is something that is going to enter into your decision that you need this to be there when you're going to select your option for getting a home of your own. What are your ideas? Just put them in the chat box. And once again, I'll rely on Becky to look at what's coming in on the chat box and read the responses and your ideas for what do you need in housing. We'll just take a pause here. Go ahead.
Jake says AC, so I'm thinking he means air conditioning, and that's a good one because not all housing has air conditioning. The reason, this is Rebecca, the reason Renee and I put this up here because folks really do need to think about, not just people with disabilities, but especially people with disabilities, when you start looking for housing, it is a really good idea to actually maybe even make a written list yourself of, I have to have this. And if this apartment complex or condo complex or duplex or house or whatever you're looking at doesn't meet these needs, then you don't have to waste your time with, filling out the application, because a lot of times even just to apply for housing, there's an application fee. So if you have an idea of what your needs are, and you do some research and you find out this particular apartment complex is not going to meet that need, you don't have to waste your money applying for an apartment there when it's not going to fulfill what you need, and it's going to make your housing difficult. So that's one of the reasons Renee and I wanted to kind of challenge you to think about, what would you need in housing when you get to the point where you're ready to look into that. It really should be something that you should consider. What is absolutely needed. And with I'm sorry, it was Jake when he mentioned air conditioning. Maybe just to throw another little thing real quick with air conditioning, there's a big difference between central air and window units. I live in an older apartment. It was built in the late 60s. And there's no central air. There's a unit in my living room and a unit in my bedroom. My office, the second bedroom, doesn't have a unit. So if I was somebody that needed to have air conditioning due to my disability, that might be a consideration, is that what is my electric costs going to be if I have to run these window units for the air conditioning to come back into my office to keep me cool. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Jake. That's a really good one. Okay, Renee, I don't see anything else. So I guess we could move on to slide 13.
Which is yours.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of questions can you be asked when you're looking at housing and moving somewhere. because there are questions that a landlord can ask, and there are questions that that are discriminatory and a landlord cannot ask. So you can be asked, can you pay your rent on time? Are you able to keep your apartment clean? Because cleanliness is an important thing. If your neighbors are full of bugs, the bugs might come over to your apartment. They can absolutely ask about any previous illegal drug use. They can ask if you've ever been arrested. Many apartments won't rent to somebody that has a felony, so they can ask if you've ever been arrested. So those are some of the questions that you can be asked. And then we'll go on to Renee with the next slide.
Okay, on slide 14, we have what are questions that are illegal to ask that cannot be asked? You cannot be asked, what is your disability? You cannot be asked, how did you acquire your disability? So with my own personal experience, a landlord or management couldn't ask me, how did you lose your vision? You also can't ask anything about the nature or extent of the disability. So someone couldn't ask me, oh, is your vision getting better or is your vision getting worse? Or, nothing that is specifically about the nature or the extent of my disability. And you cannot be asked, can you care for yourself? As Becky just said, you can be asked, can you pay rent on time? And can you be asked, can you keep your apartment clean? But you cannot be asked, can you care for yourself? Because all of us as people with disabilities have a right to get that assistance from someone else in either an unpaid or a paid assistance situation, whatever is appropriate for us. But that is a question that is illegal to ask. And so for the sake of time, let's move on to Becky with slide 15.
Okay. So let's say you do need some property modifications. How do you know how to find a contractor? Earlier on, I said that the property owner or the management company can say, sure, you can build that ramp, but it has to be done by a licensed contractor, somebody who knows what they're doing. So places you could look for include your state contractor licensing board, your local center for independent living, because often they assist folks with obtaining home modifications and they'll know of good contractors. The state vocational rehabilitation office, most state vocational rehabs have a rehabilitation engineer that works with home modifications for VR clients. Your code enforcement office. Every municipality, city, town, village has code enforcement folks, and they would know of contractors who do that sort of work. And then again, word of mouth. And I think, Renee, just for time, we probably won't do a poll here. We'll probably just move on to the next slide, please. Oh, this was mine too. Okay. Yes. One other thing we wanted to hit on before we get into some of our scenarios is, well, sometimes things happen, and when you rent, you might get an eviction notice. What would you do? How would you respond? How is that going to affect you? So at least in the all 8 states of the region that the Southeast ADA Center serves, and I imagine probably throughout the country, you can get an eviction notice, but your landlord just can't come lock you out of your unit. The written notice is usually the first step. You are usually giving, and when I was reading, going back in my states, anywhere from 10 to 30 days to respond to that written notice. Most states say you have, if you're the person that gets the eviction notice, you have a right to have, for lack of better terms, your day in court. You get to go before a municipal judge or a clerk of court or someone and say why you feel this eviction is not warranted, is not justified, why you shouldn't be evicted. If you're going through this, you can have an advocate with you. It can be a scary situation to get an eviction notice, and if you don't know and you're afraid, you can absolutely have an advocate help you through that process. That's where, if you're lucky enough to live in an area where there is a center for independent living, reach out to them. The judge actually makes the final decision. If you want to contest this eviction, the judge actually makes the final decision on whether the eviction will go through or not. Now, we didn't put this up here to kind of scare you guys. And typically the most common reasons that someone gets an eviction notice is failure to pay rent. And if you do something that actually breaks the lease agreement, if you are starting to sell drugs out of your apartment, or constantly have loud parties at night till 2 o'clock in the morning, and that breaks the noise requirement, the quiet time requirement. So, typically people don't get evicted unless, again, it's failure to pay rent, or you do something to violate the lease. But we just really wanted to let you know that if somehow this would happen to you, you have rights again, and there's a process, and you can't just be kicked out. You can't get a notice and they can't come lock your doors the next day. So next slide, please. Oh, so here we go. All right, so you guys think you're ready to move out? Well, what if you came upon this situation? What do you think would happen? So we have some scenarios here we want to read to you, and then you can weigh in with a poll, yes or no, whether you think this might be covered under the Fair Housing Act. So our first situation is Joe uses a walker as a mobility aid. He's thinking about renting a house. The landlord told Joe that it's the renter's responsibility to make sure the yard work, such as cutting the grass, trimming shrubs, all that kind of stuff, is done. So the landlord looked at Joe and asked whether he's going to be able to keep up with the yard work. Can the landlord ask if Joe is able to do, I can't read my rest of my scenario here. That just blocked my question. Can the landlord ask if Joe is able to do different tasks such as lawn care? So do you think that's a yes or no? Can the landlord ask Joe specifically if he can do yard work?
I'm sorry, because I posted the poll too soon. I didn't know it would block out your vision. We do have one answer, and it says yes.
Let's see if some more people weigh in on this.
Well, I'm not sure they can, because once I launched the poll, I tried to get out of it because it blocked the vision.
Okay.
Then I don't know how to relaunch it.
Okay.
Becky, go
So
ahead.
we'll do better on the next one. Just give me a heads up.
Go ahead.
I'll let you know. I'll say go or something like that when I'll let you.
Okay, perfect.
Right. So no, actually the landlord can't ask Joe about his actual physical abilities to do that. The landlord can say, will you be able to make sure this yard work is done, but not how can you do it, Joe? Are you going to physically do it? I mean, the landlord can say, it's kind of like the same thing with, can you pay your rent on time? Can you make sure that the yard is maintained? Not so much, how are you going to do it, Joe? Because Joe can hire somebody.
Okay, you want to move on to scenario 2?
Yep, go ahead, Renee.
All right, scenario 2. Sylvia uses in-home care providers. Can her landlord restrict the amount of time that these in-home care providers spend with Sylvia, such as a rule that there can be no overnight stays? So that is the question. Can the landlord make a rule like that and limit the amount of time that Sylvia can have access to her in-home care providers? So go on the poll.
Looks like we're not getting any responses. Maybe this is a stumper for the folks listening in.
No, I don't think you can see my end.
Oh, okay, okay.
We have 6 out of 6 that say no 100%.
Okay, well, that's very good. The answer is no. A person cannot be limited in the amount of time that they need access to their care providers, and the landlord cannot make such a rule as that and deny that person to be able to have access to those services. So let's go on to scenario 3. Go ahead, Becky.
Okay, this is Rebecca. So Emily is going to college in the fall and she plans to live on campus. She experiences anxiety and panic attacks. Her dog Shadow helps calm her during an attack, but is not a trained service animal. Can she take Shadow to college with her? Go for the poll. And this might sort of be an unfair one because we haven't really talked about it yet, but this would be a good opportunity to do so. And I completely lost the, am I still on?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay, because I completely lost my, there it is. Okay.
Can you see the results?
I can.
Yes.
So,
Okay, good.
yep, thank you. So yes, she can absolutely take Shadow with her under the Fair Housing Act, and housing at post-secondary educational institutions would fall under the Fair Housing Act. Under the Fair Housing Act, not just service animals, but emotional support animals must be permitted. Again, with documentation. So the college or the university could require documentation that Emily is a person with a disability and she needs Shadow to help with whatever. And just real quick, another thing though is HUD, Housing and Urban Development, again, the federal agency that enforces the Fair Housing Act, came out, I think it was in 2019, with a statement that online internet documentation that somebody has an emotional support animal does not need to be accepted by housing providers. Housing providers, which at college, Emily's college, could say, we need documentation from somebody who is familiar with you and has treated you that you need Shadow for emotional support. So they can ask for that, but Shadow is permitted. Somebody asked whether is it a private or public or private university. That doesn't matter when it comes to housing at universities. And I think that's it. I think because we had some more that we want to cover. So, other thing before we move into the next one, Renee, is Shadow is permitted in housing. Shadow's not permitted to go into your classroom with you because Shadow's not a service animal. She's an emotional support animal. So yes, in housing, but no, not all throughout campus. And Renee, you can take number 4.
Okay, number 4, our scenario is about Eduardo. Eduardo needs direct care providers to help him with his daily activities. He will be going to college in the fall. Can Eduardo take his personal care provider to live with him in the dorm when he goes to college? That's our poll question. Can Eduardo take his personal care provider to live with him in the dorm when he goes to college? So go yes or no on our poll. So how are we doing on response?
Okay, Renee, we have 75% that said yes and 25% that said no.
Great. The answer is yes. Under the Fair Housing Act, this is a request that can be made and should be negotiated between Eduardo and the housing department on the college where he intends to go. But he definitely can make that request. Okay.
Renee, since we only have about 3 or 4 more minutes left, let's skip 5, which was Betty and the pets community. So do you want to go ahead and take number 6, Renee?
Okay. 22-year-old Paul is finally realizing his dream. He has a job as a bank teller, and he recently moved into a snazzy new apartment complex. Paul has bipolar. He takes medication that controls his disability, and he sees a therapist on a regular basis. Paul has asked the management at his complex if he can install a pool lift. Is the management required to let Paul go ahead and install the pool lift at this apartment complex? Yes or no? Go ahead with the poll.
Okay, Renee, we have 50% said yes and 50% said no.
Oh, okay, we got a toss up here. Actually, under the Fair Housing Act, the answer to this would be no, and this is the reason, because what we know about Paul so far does not include that a pool lift is a need that would be related to his disability. If there's something that we don't know yet that would say that, okay, he does have a disability that would be related to the need for this pool lift, then it could be yes. But with the information that we have here, that he has a bipolar disability, et cetera, that is not related to his request. So the answer would be no. The management does not have to let him install that pool lift. Okay, Becky.
Yep, I'm gonna get this one in real quick. Frank has lived on the 2nd floor in an apartment building without an elevator for 2 years. He was recently in a car accident and he now uses a wheelchair. He wants to move into a 1st floor apartment and doesn't think he should have to pay another security deposit, which is what his landlord is requiring. Can he be charged another security deposit? And go ahead, yes or no with the poll, please. And I did, oh, there we go. All right, so just so you know, Renee, 20% said yes and 80% said no. That the answer actually is yes. He can be charged another security deposit because he, in essence, is signing a new lease. Now, the landlord could decide to waive the second security deposit, but in essence, he's leaving one lease and signing a new one. So under the Fair Housing Act, that would not be discriminatory to charge him a second security deposit for a new lease. So sorry, guys, we had to cut through some of those scenarios really quick. We do have, if you just wanted to advance a couple slides, there's resources that we have there. I will put I guess we don't have any time for questions, do we? I will put my email on in the chat if folks want to have any additional questions. Whoops.
Yeah, please do put questions. If you still had questions and we ran out of time, put them in the Q&A and Becky and I can look at them and answer them, and then they can be posted along with the archive of this session. So if you still had a question and we ran out of time and didn't get to your question, or if there's a burning question that you're just now thinking of, be sure and go ahead and put that question in the Q&A box, and we'll be glad to provide the best answers that we can address those with and have that posted later.
I also I posted my email in there. Folks can email me directly if they have questions. I also posted the 1-800 number for the ADA National Network. So that would route you guys to, if you call that number, that would route you to the regional ADA center for the region where you live. Those folks there can certainly answer Fair Housing Act questions. And as Renee said, I just want to say, if you have additional questions, just either email me or post them and we'll capture them, and then we will definitely get answers to you.
Thank you to everyone for joining our session today.
Yeah, we hope it was informational. We hope it's hard to get everything in within an hour, and we could have done a whole lot more on fair housing and gotten into some more good in-depth scenarios and talking back and forth and great, conversations and all. But again, thanks for joining us. We hope we presented some information that will be helpful to some of you folks, and happy apartment hunting or house hunting or whatever, whatever you, whichever way you go.
Yeah, good luck to everyone who's out there wanting to find housing.
Thank you.